She begged for death, but death sent her something worse, someone who refused to let her die. The chapel smelled of candle wax and copper. Margaret knelt before the altar in the suffocating dark of St. Matthias, her fingers trembling against the cold stone floor. 3 months without food. 3 months since the factory closed, since her daughter was taken by fever, since her husband's ghost stopped visiting her dreams. The hunger had become a religion, a prayer whispered through her ribs, a hymn sung in the hollows of her bones. She was not here to steal from God. She was here because God had stopped answering. The vestry held supplies, wine for communion, candles, the priest's private stores. Her eyes had learned to see in darkness. Her body had learned to survive on less than breath. But tonight, as her vision blurred and her heartbeat stuttered like a broken clock, Margaret understood that survival was no longer the goal. The goal was cessation. The goal was silence. The chapel door opened without sound. She did not turn. She had learned long ago that fear requires energy, and energy was a luxury the starved could not afford. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, wrong somehow. Not the priest's hurried shuffle, not the caretaker's heavy boots. These steps moved like water, like smoke, like something that had forgotten how to be entirely solid. "You're dying," a voice said. Male, ageless, carrying an accent she couldn't place. Eastern European, perhaps, or something older than geography. Margaret finally looked. The man stood in the nave's entrance, backlit by the chapel's single hanging lamp. His silhouette was sharp, geometric, inhuman. When he stepped forward, the candlelight caught his face. And she understood, with the clarity that only the dying possess, that she was looking at something that had stopped being human centuries ago. His eyes were ancient. His skin was alabaster, almost translucent, traced with faint blue veins like a map of ruins. He wore a black coat of expensive cut, but his hands, God, his hands, bore the tremor of something that had seen too much, endured too much, survived too much. "I am not dying," Margaret whispered. "I am choosing." He moved closer. The chapel's shadows seemed to bend around him, as if light itself feared his proximity. Up close, she could smell him. Rain on stone, old libraries, blood that had fermented into something sacred and profane. "You're stealing communion wine," he continued, observing the bottle she'd hidden beneath her shawl. "Not because you wish to commune with your God, because you hope the alcohol will deaden the pain enough to make the hunger bearable." She said nothing. Accuracy required no response. "I am Victor," he said, kneeling beside her with an elegance that made his immortality visible. "And I have been watching this chapel for 40 years. I have watched hundreds of the desperate, the broken, the faithful come through that door. But you pray without faith. You steal without guilt. You choose death without anger." He paused. His eyes found hers. "You are magnificent in your resignation." "I want nothing from you," Margaret said. Her voice did not shake. "The dying have nothing left to fear. Then you will hate what I am about to offer." He extended his wrist. The skin was pale as bone, traced with those terrible blue veins. "I can feel your hunger. It sings to something in me that I thought I had murdered centuries ago. The part of me that remembers being human, being starved, being alone." His voice cracked, just fractionally. "Feed from me. Not from the chapel. From me." Margaret stared at the offered wrist. She understood in that moment that she was being offered a choice that transcended death or survival. She was being offered transformation, damnation, or perhaps, and this was the truly terrible part, redemption. The chapel held its breath. The candles flickered. Outside, somewhere in the London night, the city dreamed its indifferent dreams. She took his wrist. The blood tasted like mercy and catastrophe. It flooded her mouth with warmth that was not human warmth. It was older, denser, containing within it the memory of centuries. Margaret tasted epochs, the taste of Renaissance wine and plague-struck villages, of battlefields and burning libraries, of a man who had loved once and lost everything. The blood sang of sorrow transmuted into strength, of guilt that had calcified into purpose. She drank until her body convulsed with the sudden satiation. Her starved cells screamed as they resurrected. Her vision, which had narrowed to a pinpoint of gray, suddenly exploded into color. The chapel's reds and golds became incandescent. The shadows between candles became chasms of infinite depth. She could hear the heartbeat of a rat in the walls. She could sense the pulse of blood moving through Victor's throat, even as she fed from his wrist. When she finally pulled away, gasping, her hands were shaking. Victor withdrew his wrist slowly. The puncture wounds closed before her eyes, the skin knitting together with an obscene smoothness, a horror of healing. He did not look away from her face. He studied her with the intensity of a man watching something being born or destroyed, unable to distinguish between the two. "The hunger will return," he said quietly. "In 3 days, perhaps 4. It will be worse than before, because now your body remembers what it is to be full. This is the covenant of my blood. It sustains, but it also enslaves." Margaret's hands moved to her throat. She could feel her pulse, stronger, faster, drumming with a vitality that made her want to weep. She looked at her palms in the candlelight. The skin was no longer translucent with starvation. Color had returned. Life had returned. And with it, the terrible knowledge that she now belonged to something she did not understand. "Why?" she asked. "Because I have been alone for so long that I had forgotten the reason I became immortal in the first place." Victor stood, moving to the chapel's nearest stained glass window. The glass depicted St. Michael vanquishing a demon. The colors were jeweled, violent. "I was turned by a woman who promised me eternity as a gift. It was a curse disguised as grace. For 300 years, I have wandered trying to decide which one was true. And then I watched you kneel here, night after night, stealing communion wine with the dignity of someone choosing their own ending." He turned back to face her. "And I thought, here is someone willing to choose hell. Perhaps hell is where I finally belong." Margaret rose. The chapel spun, but not from weakness, from power, from the terrible, intoxicating sensation of being remade. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now, you must decide what you are willing to become, because this," he gestured to his own form, his own eternal curse, "is not salvation. It is a different kind of hunger, one that demands blood instead of bread, one that makes you pray to daylight, to blessed water, to the 1,000 superstitions that men have created to explain what you are becoming." He moved closer. In the chapel's shadowed light, she could see the faint tracery of scars across his neck, his jaw, wounds that had healed but never faded. The marks of something that had tried more than once to end him. "But it is also," he continued, "a choice. For the first time in your life, Margaret, you are choosing not to die. And that choice has consequences that will echo through your eternity." She felt the hunger then, not for blood, but for understanding, for him, for the redemption that only someone equally broken could offer. "I have no other choice, do I?" she whispered. "There is always a choice," Victor said. "The question is whether you are brave enough to make it." The chapel's candles burned lower. Outside, London slept. And in the darkness between prayer and predation, Margaret accepted her transformation with the same resignation she had accepted her starvation, as simply another form of hunger that demanded to be satisfied. 4 nights passed in a delirium of transformation. Margaret's apartment, a single room above a shuttered haberdashery, became both prison and sanctuary. Victor appeared each evening as the sun descended, bringing with him the weight of his centuries and the burden of what she was becoming. Her body was changing. Her skin had taken on a luminescence that made her afraid to stand near the window. Her eyes had begun to reflect light like a cat's, capturing and fragmenting the lamplight into fragments of ruby and gold. The hunger was a living thing. It clawed at her from the inside, a presence more real than her own thoughts. It whispered. It promised. It demanded. On the third night, Victor taught her the ritual. Every immortal develops a practice, he explained, sitting at the edge of her bed while she lay curled on her side, her body racked with the hunger that no amount of water or bread could satisfy. A way of separating themselves from their prey. For some, it is poetry. For others, prayer. For me, it became an obsession with architecture, the study of how humans build things intended to last forever, knowing that we ourselves last forever and are never satisfied. He extended his wrist again. The gesture had become intimate, ritual. She could see the faint pulse beneath his skin, the slow thrumming of blood that did not age, did not spoil, did not diminish. As you feed, recite something to yourself, he instructed. Something that reminds you that you are not a monster, that you are choosing this rather than being chosen for it. Margaret's teeth had begun to sharpen. She could feel them. Predator's teeth, fangs emerging like a rose blooming in reverse, violent and inevitable. She did not resist. She took his wrist with a gentleness that contradicted the hunger raging in her chest, and as she drank, she whispered prayers. Not prayers to God, prayers to herself, prayers to the woman she had been, the factory worker's widow, the mother who had watched her daughter die, the human being who had chosen a chapel over a noose. Those prayers became a rosary, a chain of declarations that she was not becoming a monster. She was becoming something else, something that had not yet been named. When she finished, Victor's hand came to her face. His fingers, cold, precise, kind, wiped the blood from her mouth. "You are stronger now," he said. "By tomorrow night, you will be able to walk in moonlight without pain. By the night after, you will begin to hear things beyond human hearing, conversations 3 buildings away, heartbeats through walls. And then what?" Margaret asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Then you will understand what I have known for 3 centuries, that immortality is not a blessing or a curse, it is a mirror. It shows you exactly what you are willing to sacrifice to survive. It shows you the shape of your hunger, and it never, ever allows you to look away." He stood to leave, as he always did at dawn's approach. But this time, Margaret reached for his hand. "Stay," she whispered, "just until the sun rises." Victor hesitated. She could see the war happening behind his ancient eyes, the war between the man he had been and the immortal he had become, between the desire to protect her and the desire to be protected. In the end, he remained. He sat in the chair beside her bed, watching the darkness fade to gray, watching her transformation inch closer to completion with each passing hour. By the time the first light touched the window, Margaret understood. She was no longer starving, but she would never be full again. London became a map of blood. Victor taught her the city as a predator learns territory, not by streets and addresses, but by the rhythm of veins. He showed her how to move through crowds without being seen, how to read the pulse in a man's neck from across a room, how to distinguish between the copper of desperation and the sweetness of fear. Every human became a landscape. Every heartbeat became a geography. The wealthy areas, he explained, guiding her through the fog-slicked streets of Mayfair, are dangerous. Their blood is thin from generations of inbreeding and indulgence. It will make you sick if you take too much. The working quarters, there, The blood is rich with labor and heartbreak. It sustains better. It teaches better. Margaret found herself becoming a student of her own predation. They would spend hours in the shadows, watching humans move through their small lives, unaware that they were being catalogued, that the rhythm of their existence was being read like scripture. She discovered that hunger had a philosophy, that feeding had ethics, that even monsters could choose whom they devoured. "Why have you never killed?" she asked one night as they perched on the roof of a church, looking down at the human city moving below them. Victor was quiet for a long time. His hands, so elegant, so terrible, were folded in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 centuries of restraint. Because killing is easy. Mercy is the hard thing. He turned to her. "I became immortal because I was weak. I was starved for power, for significance, for proof that I mattered. And when I was offered eternity, I took it without considering what I was surrendering. My killer told me I would rule the night. What she did not tell me was that ruling the night meant ruling a kingdom of hunger that could never be satisfied." He gestured to the city below. "Every human down there will die, their blood will cool, their heartbeats will stop, and I will remain. That is not a blessing, Margaret. That is the true curse, to watch everything you might have loved turn to dust while you persist in unchanging agony." Margaret felt something in her chest shift. She was beginning to understand that immortality was not about power. It was about powerlessness. It was about watching time destroy everything except yourself. "Then why teach me? Why not let me die?" she asked. "Because for a moment—" Victor's eyes met hers, and she saw in them something that might have been desperation or might have been hope, and the uncertainty between them was more terrible than either certainty would have been. "For a moment, when you drank from my wrist, I felt less alone. And I am so tired of being alone that I was willing to damn another soul just to have company in the darkness." He took her hand. His grip was gentle, but absolute. "That makes me a monster, Margaret. A true monster. Not because I drink blood, but because I am selfish enough to want you to suffer beside me for eternity." Margaret did not pull away. Instead, she moved closer. And in that moment, suspended above the sleeping city, she understood that love was not redemption. Love was a shared damnation. And perhaps that was enough. 6 months into her transformation, Margaret discovered her reflection was lying. The mirror in her apartment showed her what she wanted to see: a beautiful, pale woman with luminous skin and eyes that caught the lamplight like jewels. It showed her the predator rendered elegant. It showed her the monster transformed into art. But one night, as she stared into that mirror for too long, the glamour cracked, and she saw what she truly was. The reflection showed her hunger, naked, unadorned hunger. She saw the truth of her fangs, not as an elegant predator's weapon, but as a symptom of disease. The paleness of her skin was not beauty, but necrosis. The luminescence of her eyes was not grace, but the reflection of something dead staring back at itself. She wept. Victor found her like that, collapsed on her bed, her hands pressed against her face, mourning the human woman who had starved in the chapel. That woman was truly dead now. What remained was not redemption, but replacement. The original Margaret had been erased, and in her place was something that wore her memories like a stolen coat. "The hunger will pass," Victor said, sitting beside her. His voice carried the exhaustion of 3 centuries of comforting the inconsolable. "Will it?" Margaret's voice was broken. "Or will I simply become numb to it, the way you are numb to everything else?" The silence that followed was violent. "I am not numb," Victor finally whispered. "I am drowning in feeling. I feel everything. Every death I have caused, every life I have ruined by my mere existence. The numbness you see is not peace. It is a scar. And scars, Margaret, never truly stop aching in the cold." He extended his hand, not his wrist this time, his hand, an offering of companionship rather than sustenance. "There is a ritual I have never shown anyone," he continued, "a way to see yourself not through the mirror's lie, but through the eyes of another. It requires trust. It requires vulnerability. It requires you to believe that you are not what the hunger tells you that you are." Margaret took his hand. That night, Victor taught her to see herself through his gaze. He showed her not a monster, but a woman who had chosen survival in the face of annihilation. Not a predator, but a human being who had refused to disappear quietly. The Margaret he saw was broken, yes, but she was also fierce. She was also beautiful in the way that ruined things are beautiful. Complicated, tragic, honest. "You are not what you were," Victor said, his fingers tracing the line of her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "But you are not nothing. You are transformation itself. You are the threshold between life and death, and that is sacred." In that moment, Margaret understood that redemption was not about becoming good. It was about accepting that you were capable of both monstrosity and mercy, and choosing which one to feed. The night of the masquerade ball, Victor gave her a gift. It was a ring, old silver, intricate with symbols she could not read. When she slipped it onto her finger, it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "This belonged to a woman I loved," Victor explained, adjusting the ring's position. 3 centuries ago, in Vienna. I turned her, hoping to preserve what we had. But immortality does not preserve anything, Margaret. It only reveals what was always fragile." Margaret held the ring up to the lamplight. The symbols seemed to writhe, to shift between being text and being image. She could almost read them, almost understand their meaning, but the knowledge slipped away each time she grasped for it. "What do they mean?" she asked. "They mean, I choose you, knowing that choice is the only thing either of us has left." Victor's voice was very quiet. "She died eventually, not from age or illness, but from weariness. She simply stopped existing one night while I was away, left only her body behind, like an abandoned garment." Margaret felt a chill that was not physical. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because tonight you must choose. The hunger has stabilized. You are no longer fighting your transformation. You have accepted it, and now you must decide whether you will accept me." He took her face in his hands, and she realized with a shock that his hands were trembling. "I am not asking you to stay with me out of gratitude or necessity. I am asking you to stay, knowing exactly what I am, what I have done, what I am capable of. I am asking you to choose damnation not because it is better than death, but because you choose me. That is the only thing that might make this bearable." He kissed her then. The taste of his mouth was the taste of mortality and eternity colliding. It was pain and transcendence. It was the moment before falling and the moment of landing, indistinguishable. When they parted, Margaret understood that she could refuse. She could walk away, could find another immortal, could even, with enough will and preparation, find a way to end herself. These options existed. They had always existed, but she did not take them. Instead, she took the other option. She chose him. Not because she had no choice, but because she did have a choice, and she chose this man who had learned to love in the space between hunger and mercy, who had survived 3 centuries only to nearly die when she drank from his wrist, who was offering her not a curse, but a companion in the curse they now shared. "Yes," she said simply, and the night seemed to pause, to hold its breath, as if even darkness itself was surprised by such a small word carrying so much weight. They returned to the chapel where it all began on a night when the snow fell so thick and so soft that it seemed to muffle even sound itself. The flakes descended in perfect silence, each one a small death, each accumulation a monument to transience. Margaret could hear them landing on the chapel's slate roof, a whisper so delicate that only an immortal's ears could perceive it. The city around them had transformed into something unrecognizable. London became a cathedral of white and shadow, the familiar streets rendered foreign by the erasure of color and definition. Victor moved beside her with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to exist in spaces between human perception. His breath did not fog in the cold, another cruel reminder of what they had both become. The snow did not cling to his coat. It melted the moment it touched the fabric, as if his body was fundamentally incompatible with the natural world, rejecting even winter's offer of transformation. The chapel doors opened without resistance. The priests had stopped locking them months ago, after the first of the disappearances. Now the doors stood perpetually ajar, like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Inside, the familiar geometry of the space had acquired new dimensions in Margaret's immortal perception. The wooden pews no longer appeared as simple furniture, but as the skeletal remains of something vast and breathing. The altar, which had seemed so distant during her human prayer, now revealed itself as intimate, almost domestic in its smallness. Margaret knelt at the altar rail, the same position where she had knelt on that first night, starving, desperate, ready to surrender her breath to the hunger of oblivion. The memory was strange now, like remembering a dream that had belonged to someone else. That woman, the one who had stolen communion wine with trembling fingers, seemed like a character from a story rather than a version of herself. And yet the ring on her finger was the proof that continuity existed, that the starved woman and the immortal were bound by an unbroken chain of moments. "Do you regret?" Victor asked, kneeling beside her with the formal solemnity of someone performing a sacred rite. The question hung in the chapel's frigid air. Outside, snow continued its relentless accumulation. Inside, only the two of them existed, predator and predator, immortal and immortal, bound together by blood and covenant and the terrible clarity that comes when you have nothing left to lose. Margaret considered the question with the seriousness it demanded. She could trace the lineage of her existence backward, to the moment she had drunk from Victor's wrist, to the moment she had stolen wine from this very altar, to the moment her daughter had died and taken with her the last reason to hope. Each moment existed simultaneously, the starving woman and the immortal, the desperate widow and the eternal hunter, all of them present within her consciousness at once, like layers of exposed earth in an archaeological excavation. "Regret is a human emotion," she said finally, her voice carrying harmonics that human vocal cords could not produce. "It requires the belief that you might have chosen differently, that alternative paths existed. But I was starving to death, Victor. I was not choosing between options. I was choosing between non-existence and transformation. And now that I understand what transformation truly means..." She paused, searching for language adequate to the complexity of her feelings. "I do not regret the choice, but I also do not forgive it." "Forgive what?" Victor's ancient eyes studied her with an intensity that suggested he already knew the answer but needed to hear it spoken aloud. "Being saved without consent, being conscripted into eternity as if it were a reward rather than a sentence. Being transformed into something that will outlive everyone I ever loved, that will watch civilizations rise and fall while I persist unchanged, eternally hungry, eternally aware." She turned to face him fully. "But I do not regret. Those are not the same thing, and I think you have confused them for so long that you have forgotten the distinction." The accusation hung between them, gentle, but absolute. Victor flinched as if struck. "The woman I loved," he said slowly, each word emerging as if from a great depth. She could never distinguish between the two. Her refusal to forgive eventually became indistinguishable from her inability to love. By the end, she had forgotten which was which. She simply lay in darkness, hating both the eternity I had given her and the man who had given it. And when I finally found her again, after 50 years of searching, I discovered that she had simply stopped not died, stopped, as if existence itself had become too heavy to carry. He rose to his feet, moving toward the chapel's central aisle. His shadow stretched across the stone floor like a blade, and Margaret realized with a shock that they did not cast reflections in the chapel's stained glass. The colored light passed through their forms as if they were not entirely present in the material world. They were ghosts, she thought. They had always been ghosts. The only difference was that ghosts typically had the mercy of being dead. Every immortal searches for something, Victor continued, his voice echoing through the empty space with an otherworldly quality. Some search for redemption, others for forgetting. Some search for other immortals, hoping that companionship might transform damnation into something bearable. I searched for meaning. I convinced myself that 300 years of survival had taught me something, had granted me wisdom or perspective. But the truth is simpler and more terrible. I survived because I was too cowardly to end myself, and I turned you because I could not bear to be alone with that cowardice any longer. Margaret rose and joined him in the center of the chapel. The snow outside had begun to accumulate so thickly that the windows now showed only white, the exterior world completely erased, leaving them suspended in a capsule of stone and memory and guilt. "Do you understand what you have done?" she asked, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity, as if they were discussing abstract philosophy rather than the ruin of her human existence. "You have made me complicit in your survival. Every act of mercy I perform, every human I choose not to drain completely, every moment I resist the hunger, it is not virtue. It is your virtue projected onto me, your attempt to retroactively justify the choice you made for me. I carry your redemption the way I carry the ring. I did not choose it, but now I cannot remove it without removing part of myself." Victor was quiet for a long time. The chapel held its breath around them. When he finally spoke, his voice had been stripped of all pretense, reduced to bare honesty. "You are right. I did it selfishly. I did it because I could not face another century alone. I did it because watching you kneel in the darkness, preparing for death, awakened something in me that I thought I had murdered 300 years ago. The capacity to care more about another's existence than my own." He extended his hand. Not his wrist this time, but his entire hand, palm upward, offering not sustenance, but connection. "But I also did it because in that moment, you were the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed, not because of your body or your face, but because you had chosen death with such dignity, such absolute surrender to the inevitable. And I realized that I could not let that beauty disappear into silence, that I could not accept a world that would lose you to starvation while I persisted, useless and unchanged. So yes, I was selfish, but I was also, for the first time in 3 centuries, capable of genuine love. And that love was terrible and destructive and wrong, but it was also real." Margaret took his hand. His skin was cold, but she could feel the tremor in his fingers, not weakness, but the effort of containing 300 years of grief into a moment of vulnerability. They stood together at the altar rail, 2 predators disguised as lovers, 2 immortals bearing witness to each other's monstrosity, and finding in that monstrosity something that might, if they were generous with their language, be called grace. "I think," Margaret said slowly, "that we are not a love story. We are a tragedy. And the only question that matters is whether we can be tragic together without destroying each other entirely." Victor's hand tightened around hers, the ring pressing into both their flesh like a small seal of covenant. "I have asked that question for 300 years, he replied. "I have never found an answer, but for the first time, I am no longer certain that I need one." Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside the chapel, the stained glass had begun to glow with an inner luminescence that had nothing to do with external light. Margaret realized, with a clarity that felt like revelation, that the light was coming from within themselves, from the immortal essence that now animated their forms. They were becoming luminous. They were becoming real in a way they had never been as humans. The chapel seemed to shudder around them, as if recognizing the magnitude of the choice being made within its walls. Or perhaps, Margaret thought, it was simply the weight of centuries settling more heavily onto their shoulders. Either way, there was no retreating now. They had crossed a threshold from which no return was possible. They remained in the chapel until the first light began to touch the eastern sky. Not dawn, exactly, but the approaching threat of it. Victor's hand never left hers, and when they finally rose to leave, Margaret understood that they were not running from the sun. They were running towards something else entirely, a future that neither of them could see, but that both of them, against all reason and experience, had decided to face together. 3 days before they left London, Margaret discovered that time moved differently for the immortal. Hours stretched and compressed unpredictably. A moment could contain years. A year could pass in what felt like a single breath. As her final transformation approached, that ultimate metamorphosis, where she would stop being a woman who had been turned into a vampire and become something entirely new, she found herself experiencing temporal dissonance. She would look at the clock and find that 3 hours had passed when she could have sworn only minutes had elapsed. Conversely, she would blink and discover that entire days had vanished from her consciousness, leaving only fragmentary memories of feeding and walking and standing at windows, watching the city move through its diurnal cycles. The ring Victor had given her had become a constant anchor to reality. When time threatened to dissolve entirely, she would touch it, the worn silver, the inscriptions she still could not quite read, and reality would solidify momentarily around her. The ring was a talisman against the dissolution of self that threatened as her immortality approached its final stage. She spent that last human night alone in her apartment, in the narrow room above the shuttered haberdashery where she had spent her first months of transformation. The space was exactly as she had left it. The bed with its threadbare blankets, the single chair, the window that faced the brick wall of an adjoining building. But it seemed smaller now, cramped, like a cell designed for a prisoner who had long ago accepted her imprisonment but never grown accustomed to it. She sat at the small table where she had once composed the letters, those desperate, unsent epistles addressed to her dead daughter, her absent husband, the factory that had swallowed her life. On this final night, she began to write them again. Not as elegies, she realized, but as resurrections. She was not memorializing what had been lost. She was rescuing it, transforming it into something that could survive the transition she was about to undergo. To her daughter she wrote, "My darling, you taught me that love does not require a long life, only an honest one. You were here for merely 8 years, but you changed the shape of the world so completely that I am still discovering the reverberations of your presence. When you died, I thought that proved love was fragile, that connection was temporary. But I understand now that you did not disappear. You transformed. You became the thing I carry inside myself, the reason I choose mercy over hunger, the voice that whispers when the bloodlust threatens to consume me entirely. I will carry you into eternity not as a ghost, but as a constellation, fixed, eternal, a pattern of meaning that will guide me through the centuries. Every human I choose not to drain completely is a prayer to your memory. Every act of restraint is an homage to your fierce, brief, perfect life." To her husband, she wrote, "My love, you taught me that presence matters more than permanence. You were not a perfect man, but you were a real one. And in the 15 years we had together, you taught me that reality is more valuable than any dream. When you died, I thought that loss meant I had failed somehow, that I should have held tighter, loved better, made it matter more. But I understand now that the problem was not that you were temporary. The problem was that I expected you to last, and in expecting you to last, I failed to truly see you while you were here. I will spend my immortality bearing witness to those the world overlooks, those whose lives seem too small to matter, That is my debt to you, not to forget, but to truly see, not to idealize, but to accept reality in all its imperfect, precious complexity. To the factory, she wrote, "You taught me that the world breaks people not from malice, but from indifference. You required that we move quickly, that we accept danger as the price of survival, that we view our bodies as machines to be used and discarded. I hated you for that. But I understand now that you were simply honest about what the world demands from those without power. You did not invent suffering. You merely exposed the suffering that already existed. I will spend my immortality bearing witness to those the world breaks, just as it broke me. That is my debt to you, not to hate, but to comprehend, not to forget the cruelty, but to transform it into motivation." When Victor arrived as the sun was setting on that final night, he found her surrounded by these letters. They covered the small table, they were tucked into the mirror's frame, they were scattered across the floor like the debris of a life being ritually dismantled and rebuilt. He read them in silence, all of them, every word. She watched his face as he read, watched the play of emotion across features that had learned to hide for 300 years. When he finished, he gathered the letters with infinite care, as if they were sacred texts rather than personal correspondence. "Do you know what every immortal searches for?" he asked, as he carried them to the small fireplace and began to lay them in the grate. Margaret shook her head. She had stopped trying to anticipate his thoughts months ago. His mind operated on a scale too vast, too deep, too scarred by centuries for her to follow with any certainty. "Meaning," he said simply. "Proof that the years mean something, that survival is not just biological reflex, but choice. That persistence across decades and centuries accumulates into something more than mere accumulation." He struck a match. The flame wavered, seeking oxygen. "Most immortals never find it. They simply exist, century after century, until existence becomes a kind of madness. They lose language, lose memory, lose the capacity to care about anything. They become ghosts, haunting the world long after they have stopped being alive." He held the match to the first letter. The paper caught immediately. 300 years of fire-starting practice had made him expert at coaxing flame into being. The letter to her daughter burned first, the words blackening and curling, the meaning dissolving into ash and smoke, and the particular smell of burning paper, which is the smell of recorded history returning to chaos. "But you," Victor continued, watching the words transform into cinders, "you will not become that kind of ghost. Because you are not searching for meaning in time, you are searching for meaning in connection. You are writing these letters not because anyone will read them, but because you will carry them. Every act of mercy you perform, every human you let live because you remember your daughter's brief, fierce life, that is you writing the letter again. That is you bearing witness to what matters." He moved to the second letter, the one to her husband. The flames caught it more slowly this time, as if the universe itself was reluctant to destroy words of such tenderness. Margaret watched the sentences disappear. "Presence matters. Reality is precious. See them while they are here. All of it burning, all of it being transmuted into light and heat and memory. The woman I loved," Victor said, his voice taking on the quality of something ancient and half-forgotten. She could never understand this. She thought that immortality was supposed to grant clarity, that endless years would eventually illuminate the meaning of existence. But what immortality actually grants is the understanding that meaning is not discovered. It is created, moment by moment, choice by choice, through the deliberate act of bearing witness. The third letter caught fire, and with it Margaret felt something shift inside herself. The letters were not being destroyed. They were being liberated. Released from the constraint of paper and ink, they could now exist in a more perfect form. Not as words, but as lived experience. Not as recorded history, but as active philosophy. When you complete your transformation tonight, Victor continued, turning from the fireplace to face her fully, you will no longer be the woman you were. You will no longer be the person who starved in the chapel. You will no longer be the Margaret who accepted my wrist and wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. All of those Margarets will die, and in their place, something new will be born. Not better, not worse, different. And that difference is what will allow you to carry these letters forward into eternity. He extended his wrist, and Margaret realized, with a shock that reverberated through her entire being, that this gesture had transformed over the months. What had begun as predator feeding on predator had become something else entirely. It was communion. It was sacrament. It was the most intimate form of connection two humans could share, the sharing not of words or touch or even breath, but of the essence of existence itself. "This is the last time," Victor said, and she could hear the weight of finality in his voice, the understanding that they were passing through a threshold from which no return was possible. "After this, you will no longer need me to sustain you. You will be fully immortal, fully damned, fully alive in a way that humans can never be. Your hunger will transform from external to internal. You will no longer need to drink from another to survive. You will become complete." Margaret took his wrist with the reverence of someone taking communion in a sacred rite. She was aware, in some distant part of her consciousness, that she should be afraid. This was the final death, the moment when the last thread connecting her to humanity would be severed. But she was not afraid. She was curious. She was ready. She was willing. As she drank, she felt the transformation accelerate. It was not painful. Pain was too human a category to contain what she was experiencing. It was dissolution and reconstitution happening simultaneously. Every cell in her body was being rewritten. Every atom was being reorganized according to some pattern that had been encoded in Victor's blood, in the immortality he had passed to her 3 months ago. She tasted the entirety of his existence in that final drink. She tasted Renaissance Venice and the woman he had loved there, the particular shade of gold that the cathedral domes reflected. She tasted the plague years and the centuries of watching civilization destroy itself and rebuild. She tasted his guilt, vast, oceanic, absolute. She tasted his loneliness, the special loneliness of being the only one of your kind, of being unable to connect with humans because you were no longer human, of being unable to connect with other immortals because you were desperately, fiercely individual. And she tasted, beneath all of that, a kind of hope. It was fragile, barely present, like a flame threatening to be extinguished by the slightest breath. But it was there, and it was growing stronger. When she finally pulled away, her entire body convulsed. She fell to her knees, gasping, but the gasps were not breaths. They were something else, something that used her lungs, but was not breathing. Victor caught her as she collapsed, his ancient hands strong and steady. "It is done," he whispered into her hair. "You are complete now. You are one of us. You are immortal." Margaret tried to respond, but she had no voice anymore. The human Margaret had lost the capacity for speech. She was being reconstructed from the molecular level, and somewhere in that reconstruction, human language was being replaced with something more primal, more direct, more true. She became aware of the world in a new way. She could perceive the flow of time as a physical thing, could sense the movement of years the way humans sense the movement of hours. She could perceive the building around her not as a structure, but as a living organism, could sense the slow decay of its timbers, the inevitable, eventual collapse that might take centuries or millennia, but was absolutely certain. She could perceive Victor not as a man, but as a force of nature, ancient, unchanging, radiating centuries of accumulated experience like heat. And she could perceive herself. For the first time in 3 months, Margaret looked at herself without the filter of human perception, without the distortion of hunger and transformation. And what she saw was entire, whole, not broken, not fractured, not divided between the woman she had been and the predator she was becoming. She was unified, she was coherent, she was finally, after a lifetime of fragmentation, completely and perfectly herself. Victor helped her to her feet. She moved differently now. The awkwardness she had carried for months was gone. Her body knew exactly what it was, and moved with the fluid grace of something that had achieved perfect integration with its own nature. "What happens now?" she asked, and was surprised to hear that her voice remained human. It was deeper than it had been, carrying harmonics that human vocal cords should not have been able to produce, but it was still recognizably her voice. "Now," Victor said, "we leave this city. The priest has begun to notice the absence of blood. Well, the absence of life that should accompany the blood vessels of his parishioners. In a month, perhaps 2, he will connect the murders to this chapel. In a few more months, hunters will arrive. They will set traps and wards and blessed ground. And then we must go." He took her hand, the one wearing the ring. "But before we leave, you must understand something crucial," Victor continued, his ancient eyes studying her with an intensity that suggested this was the most important lesson he would ever teach her. "We are not a love story, Margaret. We are a tragedy. And the only question that matters is whether we can be tragic together without destroying each other entirely." Margaret squeezed his hand. The ring bit into both their fingers. A small circle of pressure, grounding, real, present. It was the only thing that remained of her human life, and she realized that she did not need to hold on to anything else. Everything that mattered was already inside her. The memory of her daughter, the presence of her husband, the lessons of the factory. They were no longer external things she had to consciously remember. They were woven into her very being, encoded in the structure of her immortality. "I think," she said slowly, "that I have spent my entire life destroyed. By starvation, by loss, by the weight of surviving when I should have died. At least with you, the destruction has meaning. At least with you, the tragedy becomes something more than mere suffering. It becomes testimony. It becomes witness. And maybe—" She paused, searching for language adequate to the complexity of what she was feeling. Maybe that is redemption after all. Not grace, not forgiveness, not escape from damnation, but the choice to bear witness to the damnation, to say, this matters, this pain matters, this love matters, even if it destroys us, it matters. They stood together at the threshold of her complete transformation. 2 immortals suspended between what they had been and what they were becoming. Outside, the city slept. Inside, in the narrow room above the shuttered haberdashery, something new was being born. Something that would persist for centuries. Something that would carry into eternity the memory of a starving woman who had chosen not to die, and the immortal who had loved her enough to ensure that she never would. The fire in the fireplace burned lower, consuming the last of the letters. And in the ashes, something like meaning took shape. "Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned."